This week's Eldritch Lorecast, we are taking a deep dive into the Unearthed Arcana for One D&D and which direction Wizards of the Coast might be moving in for D&D's future, all that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the number one podcast in all of the Planescape, because that's part of the news. Anyway, I hope you're feeling inspired this week and have just rolled a critical hit, but not if you're a game master like me. Very sad. Get as many jokes and puns out at the top as I can. My name is Ben Byrne, and I'm here, as always, with Dael, Kingsmill, James Hake, Shawn Merwin. I came very close to saying Dael Hake there for some reason. I think it's the K's in the names.
We can trade surnames.
Yeah, there
James
you go.
Kingsmill.
This is very regal, has a regality to it.
Yeah.
Nice name.
James Kingsmill, James Hake, can I ask, how often when you are running games are you handing out inspiration to your players?
It is a forgettable thing. I like to hand out inspiration, but I often, if I don't forget it, I will sort of second guess myself into not performing a favoritism on players. And so I'll often find instances where in the fiction, the characters can be inspired rather than as a metagame reward for good roleplay. If the characters, for instance, go to a bathhouse, and relax, they go to the sauna and relax for a day, then they emerge with inspiration, something like that. Something that actually feels like, okay, you're at better than peak performance before you go out on an adventure. Here is your inspiration for that.
Shawn Merwin, how often, when do you hand out inspiration?
It generally depends on what kind of game I'm running. What I've finally turned to for my home game is telling the players when another player does something cool, you give them inspiration, something that inspires you, something that makes you laugh. But then I will put out tokens to make it a little easier to remember. I find that helps rather than just saying it as a reminder. But I've been all over the place. I've gone for weeks and weeks of games without giving any, and sometimes I'll hand it out like proverbial candy.
Dael Kingsmill, your inspiration habits. Is this a rule you like, you enjoy using?
I'm rubbish with inspiration. I have no thoughts in favor or against it, but I just forget about it. If I'm a player and I've been given inspiration, I forget about it. If I'm a DM and a player does something cool, I forget about it. So I'm going to own that. That's all on me. There's nothing wrong necessarily with inspiration. That's all me.
Yeah, that's fair. I feel very much the same. I very rarely hand it out. Even when I give it to the players, similar to what I think Shawn or James were saying, give it to the players to give each other inspiration. Then they instantly forget to do it as well. So it is unfortunately...
You know what I do is I put a D4 on top of my D20 so that I can't pick up the D20 without remembering why I put the D4 on top of it. That's my system.
Perfect.
If I can opine about inspiration for a little bit, it to me seems like an attempt to bridge the gap between two somewhat disparate styles of D&D players. And that's the thing that D&D tries to do a lot. It tries to be a game that everyone can enjoy, which I think is a very noble goal. But it sometimes creates strange, kludgy mechanics like inspiration, where it's intended to be a little reward for role-playing. But I get the sense that, for you and me at least, Dael, the people we play with just kind of like role-playing. And so we don't really need to have a carrot to reward them when they do it. And that's not, my players are better than yours or anything like that. It's that my players are players who like role-playing, and that's a completely value-neutral statement. So we just don't need or use inspiration very much.
One quick announcement I just quickly wanted to make, if it so interests you, is that Dael and I will be appearing on a live stream at the end of this week with the Dungeon Dudes, playing through a little Drakkenheim adventure, playtesting or showcasing rather their apothecary class, which is coming out in Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakkenheim, which is their current Kickstarter, which is up now. I would throw a link quickly into the chat, but I'm going to be too slow, so just Google Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakkenheim. And I think it's 7 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday is when we will be doing it, which will be 9 a.m. Australian time on Friday. Good luck, everybody else. Secondly, I did want to fit in a little bit of Spelljammer, just like recap here, but it feels like we have no great time to talk about Spelljammers given the urgency of the current news. But I did just want to give a quick shout out because you've got yours.
There we go.
I wondered where you were going, James. I was like, you must have
I had to get my Spelljammer.
We lost them. We lost them.
Have you had a chance to take a look through it yet? Is it like surface level feelings about it?
It looks very pretty.
It's gorgeous. Honestly, it's really cool to see this. I got to put it in front of my face. I can't do it otherwise. I'm not used to showing off books on camera. I'm not a YouTuber. I think it's really cool that it comes as a 3-book set. It's something that, much like Spelljammer itself, harkens back to an elder age of D&D. And it's very cool that, spoiler alert, the Planescape set they're releasing, I think, is taking the same tack. If I remember the announcement correctly.
Have you had a chance to flick through it? Are you feeling positive about it generally?
I like Spelljammer. I mean, like, before Spelljammer came out, we at Ghostfire released our second fable, Pirates of the Ethereal Expanse, which has a lot of superficial similarities to Spelljammer, even though its particulars are quite different. Just the idea of wooden sailing ships aesthetically in a sort of galactic setting with pirates and weirdos and, Mos Eisley Cantina residents is it's my idea of a good time. So just from a purely aesthetic standpoint, Spelljammer is great. And I think for the very most part, the Spelljammer release does a good job of that. In fact, Pirates and Spelljammer, Light of Xerxes, the adventure that's bundled with it, share an author in the form of Sadie Lowry, who I worked with on Netherdeep as well, and she's fantastic. So I love all that stuff. The only thing I think it's missing is ship rules. There's not a lot of rules for piloting or battling in Spelljammers in Spelljammer, which
reminiscent of Odyssey, the Odysseys, Mythic Odysseys of Theros. I got there in the end.
Oh, really?
No, they pointed you to Saltmarsh if you wanted ship rules. And I remember being very bitter about it.
Interesting. And honestly, in Theros, it's not like a Greek trireme is at all comparable to a Saltmarshy, 2-masted sailing ship. Anyway, so Fables 2 Pirates of the Ethereal Expanse does have ship combat rules, and I just want to say... they're nothing like Spelljammers. They're sailing ships, but they operate ship style, right? Spelljammers are these 3-dimensional cool things, and that's a big difference. The Fables has ships that operate on 2 dimensions. But Spelljammer is great. I think this is a top-notch release. I really do. It's just missing, I think, an important thing in the form of ship combat.
Sure, that's fair. Perhaps it could also do, there's a lot of new character races in there, but perhaps it could also do with some further explanation of aliens and weirdos. Dael Kingsmill, you have recently released with VJ Harris on DM's Guild, Beings from Beyond the Horizon.
Actually, I need James to say, Beings from Beyond the Horizon.
Beings from Beyond the Horizon.
See, it's great. He's very handy to have around. Speaking of Mos Eisley Cantina, there was a throwaway thing that I mentioned on this podcast, actually. This is where it originated. We first were looking at the Unearthed Arcana races that we assumed correctly were going to be attached to Spelljammer. And I said, they're really cool, but you know what? I wish they would do something a little bit more... for lack of a better word, unorthodox, unhinged with the ancestries and let you kind of make really wild aliens. Because it's one of my favorite things when you're in a space movie and you go to the Mos Eisley Cantina or you go to Montressa Spaceport and you just see this weird and wild range of, just strange looking beings. And so VJ Harris, Vic, got in contact and said, hey, do you want to make something for the DMs Guild that does that. And I was already familiar with their work on An Elf and an Orc Had a Little Baby, which I think was incredibly innovative, really clever design work. And so I got really excited about it. We got to work on that, and it was a delightful time. And I'm pleased with what we came up with. We ended up using so Vic has this incredible breakdown of point values for different racial features that already exist in the game, and then guidelines on how to make new features that follow a similar point value. And we ended up utilizing that in a way where you can kind of randomly mash features together to make an alien that's brand new that you don't even know what it's going to be yet, or you can buy features and stick them together into something that you want, something from Ben 10, I don't know, any number of inspiration points that we took. Or you can start with a pre-existing race from the game and just swap out traits according to point values. And I don't know, it's cool. I've always loved that sort of, I don't know, barn door mix and matching of features to create beings. And then we were super lucky to get Paul Burrow, who I knew from way back in the Geek and Sundry days, who's a sci-fi artist, to do a cover for the book that was kind of like, we wanted it to look like vintage alien monster movie posters. And that's where we ended up with the title. It's just a lot of fun. So yeah, you can add tons of really alien aliens to your Spelljammer game.
Get as alien as you wish with
beings from beyond the horizon.
On DM's Guild right now. Go grab it to add more aliens to your games of Dungeons and Dragons. Speaking of Dungeons and Dragons.
Speaking of Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons is, some would say, almost singular among the tabletop role-playing game industry, community. It is almost an industry unto itself. It is one Dungeon and Dragon. No longer shall we have editions of Xbox. We will only have one Xbox from now on. We're doing away with console generations. Wait, sorry, I'm getting confused. I don't think it's controversial to say the somewhat atrociously named One D&D, which I feel like we all felt about the Xbox One at the same time.
I'm really glad you mentioned it, because I hate the name. It's like companies do this thing because they think, oh, it's cool because it signals completion, and we've finally reached like the final ultimate version of the thing. And you do end up making new versions of the thing. You have Xbox One. It was even 360. That did the same thing. Xbox 360, Xbox One Series S. Like it's a dark path, and we shouldn't go down it.
I feel this. I'm coining right now Vanilla 5e being a rare. Like, I had to ask someone just the other day. It was like, all right, so you're gonna have to create a character for this, and I was like, okay, maybe in this new and weird world we're living in, do I need to ask? Is it Vanilla 5e, or are we using the One D&D Unearthed Arcana? And I suppose it is an Unearthed Arcana for now, but there is so much to drill into with it. I thought I would just invite Shawn to pick up where he left off a moment ago, talking about inspiration, or anywhere else he may choose.
Well, I mean, let's talk about the name, because the name has a lot to do with everything else we're going to be talking about. Because while we can talk about the mechanics and we can talk about the fun that we have playing it, we also have to talk about marketing, and we also have to talk about business. And what do they want? What happens when you announce a new edition usually? Sales plummet. So they have to be very careful to not call it a new edition. They have to be very careful to talk about the backward compatibility. They have to be very careful to keep hitting that point that everything that you've bought so far you can still use. And all of these 5, 6, 20, 100 new books, whatever's coming out now, between now and the 2024 release, they want you to buy. They want you to know it's going to be still useful. So people are already getting the name wrong. Even those people who try to say One D&D are calling it D&D 1. So it's going to be called,
done with this name change.
Exactly. So it's, it is what it is. We'll get over the name. People are going to call it 6th edition or 5.5 or whatever they want to call it, but we will, keep an eye on it, but we will hopefully now focus on more interesting things like what are they putting into One D&D?
Well, maybe I was going to start with the mechanics side, but maybe talking about the business side to start with, because there's a lot of stuff that I think was implicitly said in the announcement from Wizards Presents rather than explicitly said. And I've completely forgotten the question that I was going to ask Shawn that kind of linked into that.
If you've forgotten, I'll seize upon this momentary lapse and give you some time to think. I think people who are getting out of sorts about D&D 1 need to recall what happened in 2014. Which is when D&D Next became Dungeons and Dragons. And there's something very important to remember here is that 5th edition also did away with an edition name. We didn't, everyone called it 5th edition because of course that's what it is. But in early 5e material, if I'm remembering right, there really was not much reference to the fact that it was a 5th edition of the game. There was a strong push towards unification of the D&D brand, which was not just an RPG, but also a line of board games and video games and novels. And this was just the RPG version of Dungeons and Dragons. And to be perfectly honest, I think whenever One D&D graduates from its playtest name, just like D&D Next did, people will go right along to calling it 6th edition. And eventually, 5 years down the line, even the Wizard staff will relent and start referring it as 6th edition. Certainly OGL people will. There's so many products that just say 5th edition and don't mention D&D at all because, of course, they can't.
Right. When the open game and license doesn't allow you to say D&D, you have to call it something. So what's the shortest thing we can call it? 5e. Uses the least amount of characters and let's move from there.
Yeah. It almost doesn't matter what you can't give yourself a nickname, so to speak, because I had the same thought. I don't think it says 5th edition or 5e. I could be wrong about this, but in the player's handbook at least, and in the DMG, I wouldn't think it uses those terms. But you can't say Dungeons and Dragons. The other phrase, I want to talk a little bit about this wasn't the question I had before, but I'm just going to jump to this because it's what's in my brain at the moment, is the 3D virtual tabletop. When I say they said things implicitly, there was a bit of phrasing I wasn't very impressed with, which is when they were like, previously you had to cobble together lots of different virtual, or not virtual tabletops, but lots of different apps to be able to play D&D, which I feel is somewhat disingenuous to some very excellent virtual tabletops, character creators, whether they were using the OGL or however they were kind of licensing themselves. And that unification obviously feels from the business side of things like we want you to get your D&D from us. It almost reminds me, there's an old phrase that Shawn or James might be able to correct me on, which was it Gygax at one point in the past said you're only playing D&D if you're using all of the rules. And this feels you're only playing D&D if you're on D&D Beyond using the virtual tabletop.
I love the correct assumption that I wouldn't know the Gygax quote.
I'm sorry, Dael, I didn't mean to leave you out.
You were right.
Well, technically he was wrong because I don't know that quote.
I'm relieved.
Yeah, I don't know that quote either, Ben. Have you invented this quote? Did you make it up?
Maybe I made it up. Look, I may be misquoting.
Ben is Gary Gygax.
This whole time. Unmask myself. But even with the way that the digital codes are being used, is that you can only get your physical product with digital code if you purchase through Wizards directly, is my understanding at this point. And if you do that, you get your digital code 2 weeks earlier than everybody else, which was, speaking of Microsoft, which was a strategy that pre-orders in the video game sphere tried to use, which was like play the game a week early or whatever if you get your digital code. So I guess, how do we feel about this like push to really, it almost feels like cut out the middleman. Maybe that's a little too strong a statement, but that general kind of implicit vibe that Wizards are giving off about this.
I'm not remotely surprised about it. Like, what else are they going to do? They're a company that's the kind of thing that they have to look out for on their end. But it is definitely interesting to see the way it's being framed. Like you're saying, a lot of it is this implicit kind of the way that they've wrapped stuff in language and the sort of undercurrents of what that means. Amongst that, you get this thing of, they're saying get it all in one place, but at the same time, you're still going to be buying each of those products separately. So ultimately, the thing they're selling you on is ease of use. And that will end up being really effective. It's a slightly different kind of scenario, but when you track levels of piracy, when it is easy to access television shows in one place, even if you have to pay for it, people will pay for it because it's easy. But when everything was on Netflix, and I'm not saying that everything should be on Netflix because, monoliths are also troublesome. But, when everything was on Netflix, piracy was at an all-time low because you could pay for Netflix and get everything there. And then every other company thought, well, why don't we have our own streaming service? Why are we outsourcing this? We should do our own thing. And now we've got 1 million different streaming services. It's back to being exactly like pay TV was. And piracy is rising again because you can't really justify paying for all these different streaming services when it's not easy, when you have to flip between all of them. So it's that ease of use that is going to be very, very effective in selling that for D&D.
Wow, that was really, really well said. I thought I had something to add, but Dael, I think you kind of grabbed the entire basket there.
I think the one thing, while absolutely Dael hit the nail right on the head, the one thing to be aware of is in previous editions, the digital technologies that Wizards provided were not always robust, were not always easy to use. And in some cases, third parties, even people just doing it in their spare time, were able to create something more useful than Wizards of the Coast could. And there will certainly be people, let's just say, for example, Wizards of the Coast does not allow any other official third-party virtual tabletops to use their stuff. Even then, people will find ways to use Wizards products on another virtual tabletop, but it will probably not be the case where their versions are better than what Wizards can provide, assuming that D&D Beyond continues its track record of putting out pretty good stuff that's very usable.
That's a really good point, Shawn. I was chatting with a friend of mine over at Paizo the other day about this exact same topic, and we were puzzling through two recent events, two recent acquisitions, one by Wizards, one not by Wizards, in which Wizards acquired D&D Beyond, of course. That is now the backbone of their digital strategy. However, also, we've talked about this on the podcast in prior weeks, Roll20 recently acquired One Bookshelf, which is the parent company of both DriveThruRPG and the Dungeon Masters Guild, which Wizards has a not insignificantly vested interest in. It gets them a really not insignificant amount of revenue quarter over quarter. And this really raises the question, would Wizards do something that so monolithically competes with one of their partners? When it came to D&D Beyond, they didn't build their own digital tool set. They just bought D&D Beyond. But when it comes to VTT, if they were going to buy Roll20, I think they would have done it by now, before announcing that they're doing a virtual tabletop.
And what was fascinating to me about the virtual tabletop announcement was the visuals. They bore striking similarity to Tailspire, which is a pre-existing virtual tabletop that focuses on the visuals. It has that same, whatever that camera angle is called that makes things look tiny. It's
they had a special proprietary word.
There was a fancy word, yeah. The micro camera,
figure view, something,
whatever it was,
just kiddo.
And everything is made to look like minis, and you roll dice and you see the dice roll. Like it's made to look like a really fancy tabletop
just
game.
Like in Stranger
Things. Got Dwarven Forge and everything. And And it's got visuals that are so reminiscent of Tailspire that I genuinely thought while watching it that they might have purchased Tailspire. And I haven't been able to find any reference to that actually having happened. So I'm trying to figure out, have they built something that is the same? Are they as far along as Tailspire are? Because Tailspire have been working really hard. They're a small team. They didn't, they kickstarted for, I want to say $400,000. Like, it wasn't the biggest thing in the world, but they've been chugging along and they've been doing good work. We've seen them on, I think, Dimension 20, providing digital sort of environments for the combat. And it is interesting to me that they've gone in this direction because Tailspire is a hungry program. It is visually gorgeous, and you can build your own stuff like it with The Sims, but it takes a lot of power from your computer, and it takes a lot of buy-in from players and the DM running it. And so it's surprising to me that D&D would go in that direction for their virtual tabletop rather than something that is genuinely accessible and easily usable by everyone, because someone with their, dinky 5-year-old laptop is going to have trouble running a program like that.
And maybe that is why they will continue partnering with Wolf Running.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering if Roll20 was already working on something like this kind of in the background and gave them resources.
The other thing on this front, and this is maybe cynical of me, but during that announcement trailer, this new Unreal-powered virtual tabletop is in early development. When it comes to this new program, I'll believe it when I see it. I've lived through Project Morningstar, through the 4E thing, through the 3E thing. Wizards has a bad track record with this sort of thing. And while I now believe that they have really the full support of Daddy Hasbro behind them, rather than the sort of tepid support of Daddy Hasbro behind them, this is much more likely. But still...
Does Daddy Hasbro, is that just the Monopoly guy? Is that who that is? just
it is now.
Yeah, exactly. Is Monopoly Hasbro? I don't even know if
it is.
I sort of thought the same thing. I saw on Twitter somebody kind of saying, who's this VTT for if you can't run it on, if you need a high-end laptop to be able to run this thing, it's not going to be really mass marketable in that way, because I think that the overlap between PC gamers and role players, that Venn diagram isn't as much of an overlap as you might think. But
how great will it be for streamers with their big gaming rigs who now are able to get sponsored to run D&D streams?
Well, the announcement and the way that they shot it as well seemed to indicate that they wanted people to be able to run this on their tablet, right? Like, it didn't seem to be flat screen TV down on the table. That could be one use of it, or it could be online use. But I think, similar to the Switch rooftop party kind of like demonstration of use case, they had people sitting at a table with their VTT on their iPad or whatever, or on their tablet in front of them, kind of all looking at the same thing. And so it makes me wonder, what if they do sort of a streamed game solution where they're processing everything. You're not running it on your own computer. It's more that you log into something and then you kind of run it that way. But that relies on a really good internet connection. So
the RuneScape method.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That would certainly be an interesting solution, and it would square with what I'm assuming is going to be a subscription model rather than a purchase model.
Which, for the record, I'm still wary of, but we've been there before. So.
But what's the model as well, right? Because my understanding from the announcement seemed to indicate, and I don't think they out and out said this, so this may be me making things up, but it seemed to indicate that it's like, all right, when you buy an adventure, like, the Phandelver adventure next year, maybe not that one, but like whatever in the future, Curse of Strahd, you get the tiles and the art assets to create the Curse of Strahd dungeons, and they're already created for you. Here's Castle Ravenloft, all beautifully 3D rendered with all the levels and everything. And then you get those tiles or pieces or art assets, to fit together the way that you want to create your own dungeon. But does this mean...
Like The Sims!
Yeah, exactly. But does this mean that you have to purchase the adventures to get access to a wider variety of dungeon tiles, if they're selling them only in like adventure packs?
I mean, I'm purely speculative, but I don't think that it would be difficult to separate those things, right? To both bundle it with an adventure and then also have a separate cost and you can buy it as its own asset pack. I don't think that would be outside the realms of imagination. Can I say just really quickly what my most ludicrous reaction to the One D&D playtest stuff was, so that it's out of the way, so it's just out there. My immediate reaction, it has a different, okay, I didn't notice that I had a synesthetic color sort of association with tabletop RPG mechanics until now. But I don't like the color of this as much as the color of 5e. But that could just be because it's playtest material, honestly. I mean...
What color are you referring to? Are you referring to the red of the logo?
No, okay. So
it's
synesthesia.
It's not a literal color. Yeah.
So, okay, synesthesia is a thing where you associate your senses get crossed in your brain basically, and you just have associations between one sense and another sense. So like very extreme versions could be there's a man out there in the world who, when he hears things, he tastes things, right? That's a very extreme version. A very common version, which my siblings and I discovered that we have when we were arguing about the color of Wednesday as children, is that we associate concepts and words with colors or numbers with colors, things like that. So, you know, I know that my name is green, you know, this is Ben as a name is blue, but Ben as a person is red. James's name is red and Shawn's name is blue, but a different blue to Ben's. Ben's is dark blue. So, you know, just things like that, right? But this is long, and I'm sorry. D&D 5e, the mechanics have kind of a jewel tone like green, which I enjoy. Whereas the Unearthed Arcana that we've seen for One D&D is a little bit closer to the 4e color, which is like a light blue, but there's more gray in it. But I think that it might change colors as it becomes not playtest material, as we see stuff that isn't character creation. We'll see. But just for the record, it may color the rest of my opinions.
Good joke.
I got that. But I have a very important question then, Dael. What color is Fate Accelerated?
Ooh.
Fate Accelerated it's light blue, but it's higher in vibrancy.
Okay.
Than 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we've also learned 4e is blue. Speaking of the Unearthed Arcana and its amazing Technicolor, what do we think? Where do we want to start in terms of like cracking into this rule set? What do we like? What don't we like?
Can we start with the new race? The Ardlings.
Yeah. What's that about? The
animal-headed celestial beings. Interesting to have a celestial player race by default that is not the Azamar. Or has so often been the counterpart to the tiefling. I'm not sure I have much of substance to say about them other than they're there. Cool. I'm interested in them. I don't know much about them.
I'm surprised.
Yeah.
I was surprised when it was like, oh, and your animal appearance will be categorized by your blah, blah, blah background. You know, whatever the new,
lineage.
not sub-races, whatever they're called now. Lineage. Thank you. It's divided up by that. I was expecting them to be categories that like ran on a theme. You know, I was expecting sort of prey animals and predator animal or birds or something. You know, I was expecting lists like that, but it was really like you could be a cat, you could be an eagle, you could be a goat. I don't remember what they were, but they had nothing in common with one another. And I'm like, I will absolutely have to look at this list every time.
So the exalted legacy is cat, eagle, goat, mule as their suggested animal. The heavenly legacy has elephant, owl, pig, and stork. And the idyllic legacy has bear, dog, raven, and toad.
Yeah, so like I'm on board, but I'm a little confused.
It is very interesting.
I mean, I wonder if there's like mythological connections, mate. I mean, Dael, maybe you might know that because they were talking about how in, Egyptian mythology.
Egypt isn't my specialty, so I mean, there could be, and I just am not aware of it. But
There just isn't very much.
Toads and pigs
here.
aren't really.
Right. Can we step all the way back and say, are we surprised that it is as much like 5e as it is? Were we expecting something a little more different?
Really.
Were you?
Okay. Literally, I was hoping. And this is just a play test, obviously.
Yeah.
But part of me was skeptical because with 4th edition, they sort of said, well, 5th edition, you'll be able to play just like 4th edition, or you'll be able to play a version of the next edition, like it's more similar to 4th. And they obviously did not do that. And when they said this next version will be backwards compatible, my first thought was, that's too bad, because I'm looking for new design. I'm looking for something different. I'm looking for something that wows me in a way that 5th edition, did. I love 5th edition, but what the designer in me, right? The player that wants to play something different said, all right, what are you going to show me? And what they showed me was, we really didn't redesign anything. We are going to cosmetically move traits around a bit. We're going to move ability scores to a different place, but it's definitely the same chassis. And so part of me is like, okay, good. It's compatible. We're going to be fine. And then part of me is like, oh, I want something different. And that's just me personally as a designer, right? I understand why they're doing it this way, and they would upset a lot of people if they did something completely different. But I always go back to what does a role-playing game do for us? What do the rules, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to give us a way to resolve conflict and tell a story. So we need the rules, but we also need a setting, right? The rules also speak to the world in which this game takes place. And the world also helps us tell a story. The rules help us tell a story. And so I'm looking at all of the ways where things work together. We talk about inspiration, right? Inspiration comes it's almost a weak version of fate points from fate, right? Inspiration was supposed to be your character does something that speaks to its background, just like aspects do in Fate. So when you do that, and there was almost this implicit, when you play your character in a way that's detrimental to their character's success, but you do it because your character would be that way or do that thing, here's your later benefit for that. And almost immediately that was thrown out to, oh, you made everybody laugh, you did something cool. Okay, so I wanted to see inspiration move back to bring the personality, bring the role playing and the story together with the mechanics. And instead, it's almost moving in the opposite direction of, oh, you rolled a natural 20? Have inspiration. So you succeed here, you can succeed more later. I don't know, which sort of takes away from me the drama that story and rules can create when they work well together.
It's very interesting, I think, that inspiration is becoming a win more sort of button. There have been, I don't like just parroting what I see on social media, but I did think this is a really great idea. People have talked about moving that gain inspiration on a critical to the critical failure to a natural one. And I think that's something that D&D has had a problem with, or not a problem with, but like it has not reflected for its entire lifespan, which is you in real life often learn more from your failure than you do in your success. You know, in D&D, you gain experience for winning, not for losing. So having a way to gain inspiration from failure, it seems like a nice little bit of, softening the blow, but also a little bit of realism, as weird as it sounds.
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about there are games out there. I think Monster of the Week, which is powered by the apocalypse. But you know, there are game systems out there where explicitly you progress by failing. Mm-hmm. You have to do badly in order to level or achieve the equivalent of leveling. But it's interesting just hearing you both talk about it. thinking that I think how I feel about it is starting to become clear in that because this was pitched on sort of in the whisper circles for so long as 5.5e. I wasn't expecting it to be, brand new design. I wasn't expecting it to bring me, super innovative stuff. I was expecting it to kind of go back and renovate everything that was already existing in 5e that needed some renovation. But now that I'm stopping and thinking about it, it is interesting that with what they're calling currently One D&D, and they're like, this is the ultimate version of D&D. We've finally reached fantasy tabletop RPG Shangri-La. They are kind of taking D&D stuff and concentrating it. Rather than taking these little mechanics that we're pointing out from other games, they're going, what did D&D do? How can we do that more? How can we take the D&D-est D&D from previous D&Ds and put them in this D&D to consolidate its D&D-ness?
And in fairness, 5e did that too.
It's the way it goes. There's a folk element to tabletop RPGs that I think... I'm not genuinely like scared that it'll disappear. I think folk engagement is hard to eradicate, right? But there is something that, again, is that sort of implicit way that we're using language, or that Wizards are using language in this release, which is kind of doing that we've reached Shangri-La thing, right? It's saying the point is to reach a version of it that never needs to be updated again.
Yeah.
Which is what Pathfinder did as well, and look how that went. But, it's that thing of we've made it, we've done it, we're finally here. And that seems a little bit like, naively self-aggrandizing.
Yeah.
If I'm to be a little bit uncharitable about it, because I think that one of the cool fun folk things about D&D is that every 10 years or so, you get a new team of people working on it, and they're inspired by such new and varied things that it fundamentally changes what the game looks like, the shape of it. Yeah. It in that way, it is ever changing but ever present.
When I was first getting into D&D, sorry, Ben.
Go ahead.
When I was first getting into D&D, I was often on D&D message boards, upon which the edition wars ran rampant. And one of the things that people talked about whenever an edition war was happening were the sacred cows of D&D, things like natural 20s and ability scores and things that are so fundamental to the identity of D&D that they can never be removed. On those boards, people talked about sacred cows like they were bad things. If D&D would be so much better if it didn't use a D20 with its bad randomization curve. It would be better if it were more like this other game that uses 3d6. It would be better if it had 4 ability scores, if it had 8 ability scores, if the ability scores were called, something else other than what they are now. And it always surprises me. It didn't surprise me then. I didn't have much of an opinion on it back then. But now looking back, it surprises me to hear those opinions stated so vehemently by, self-professed fans of D&D. They love D&D so much as a concept, but it would be so much better if it were less like D&D. I find myself of two minds in this situation now, where it's like, on one hand, I think things like natural 20s and D20s and 6 ability scores are fundamentally D&D, and I wouldn't change them even if I wanted to. But on the other hand, I like the way that D&D learns from other games. I like the way that indie game design eventually, concentrates up like a tuna fish devouring all these other smaller fishes into mainstream D&D design. My metaphor to D&D design is apparently about Mercury content. I'm not sure what I'm getting at there. But the thing is, I like it when D&D has a wide variety of inspirations, and it is a little bit distressing, Dael, like you talk about, for D&D to become incredibly insular and sort of inward-looking like this.
Which it might not, but I also think it's funny to hear the idea of natural 20s as being like a core element of the game, because to me that is a great example of a folk element of the game. Everyone's version of a nat 20 and what it does and when it happens is slightly different. It changes from table to table, and I always feel a little bit like, get your grubby fingers off my crits whenever it gets really formalized within the rules. I'm like, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah, that's fair. I think just to touch on very quickly with what Dael was saying a second ago, the self-aggrandizing, I don't think it's naive at all. I think it's very deliberate, and that's why if it's a real quote, it's why it reminds me of that Gary Gygax quote of, you're only playing D&D if you're playing with all the rules, because the intention of that being said at the time was to get people to purchase advanced D&D and all the books to be able to, because there were spin-offs and Pathfinder-like games in those early years of the game that were trying to, muscle in on D&D's market share. And it was like, it's only D&D if it's this much. And I think that that's a very deliberate strategy. And I think it's maybe why they've shot so high with the virtual tabletop, to not just be like a flat map, but to be this beautiful, like 3D, fully rendered, move the mouse around, you can measure out distances, it all looks amazing, because they don't want to have a virtual tabletop, they want to have the virtual tabletop within the marketplace, because D&D is the role-playing game within the marketplace. Sorry, Shawn, you were about to say something. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to talk about the role of marketing again in this, because while what we're seeing is a playtest, obviously, and so we will be able to give feedback, and that feedback will hopefully tell Wizards of the Coast what people think they want, and then Wizards can give the people what they think they want, and then they can ask, well, here's what you said you want, what do you really want? And then they can go, how do you mesh what people really want with what Wizards can and is willing to and must give people to meet whatever business goals, whatever marketing goals that they have sitting behind all of this design. And the marketing and the business goal might be, don't change anything while changing things. Or it may be, maybe something different. We don't know. And we probably never will know, although we can step back and, based on what we see, come up with what their marching orders probably were or are. But it's a constant battle of all of these different influences and inputs, and making a really great role-playing game versus making a really popular role-playing game. And are those two the same thing? If it's really popular, does it mean it's good? Or can it be bad but still be very popular? In terms of mechanically balanced, in terms of all these things, and there are no right answers to these questions I'm spouting. Although we can speculate on all of them.
Oh, this is so exciting! It's
certainly not a job that I envy.
It's just like 2012 all over again. Everyone, go look up that one Penny Arcade comic about the D&D Next playtest and how all of these people and their desires do not mesh even in the slightest bit. That comic is perfectly prescient for exactly what's going to happen right now.
We got an email from Beckett, who was asking about incorporating community feedback into rules design work, and how that usually tends to pan out. They were talking specifically about 2012, about D&D Next, when that was happening, and there was a lot of interesting design work in there. If I'm not mistaken, James, they actually had ability scores tied with backgrounds first. I feel like I read that on Twitter, but that could be wrong. But just using that as an example of a bunch of ideas that they had for D&D Next that ultimately got thrown out. Whether it's because of community feedback or not, that's what Beckett sort of seems to indicate was their perception of the time. And so how does community feedback influence the D&D or the One D&D playtest, and how does it influence the future of the game in terms of how much Wizards listen to their audience versus how much they, just trust in their own expertise, I suppose?
The thing that community-driven feedback tends to do is it tends to drive design towards whatever is most popular. And maybe that sounds obvious, but it has a lot of very specific implications in what it means. It means that a D&D whose design is driven by community feedback is less likely to have catastrophic failure in the case of like 4th edition, for example, which by a lot of metrics was a pretty good game. But because it aggravated, it didn't just disappoint, it actively aggravated a not insignificant part of the D&D fan base, it was a catastrophic failure. And what this means, like I said, there's a lot of different meanings here. On the plus side, this is a D&D that everyone can get behind. This is a D&D you can basically always find a table for. That's fantastic. It's a D&D that's easier to teach people. If you want to take a dimmer view of it, it's a D&D that's kind of, watered down. It's a D&D that's very genericized and bland, and it doesn't have all those rough edges that some people like and some people don't like. And, those idiosyncrasies are very, very fun for people who like very specific things. I'll opine for a little bit. I think that a flat baseline of D&D is a good thing. It leaves the specific stuff up to the more niche publishers like us. For, Wizards is not going to release a Blood and Guts Dark Fantasy module, most likely. That's what Ghostfire does. They're not going to release a highly 4th edition inspired tactical pet class. That's what MCDM does. There's all of these reasons for third parties to exist. And a very sort of common ground D&D fosters a good environment for that.
I also think that releasing a playtest like this, even though it does, for the record, there's a lot that I like about this playtest. I feel like we're just ending up talking about the slightly more negative or existential stuff because that's the juicy stuff for a podcast. But there's a lot that I like about it. But, it does drive this kind of conversation. What do we hate about the new rules, right? But at the same time, it's acclimatizing us to this stuff. You hear that Netflix is going to add ads to the lowest cost version of their thing, and you're outraged about it, but you get used to the idea over time, so you're not surprised when it happens, and it doesn't matter as much to you when it happens. And a similar thing is going to happen here, where some stuff that people are complaining and making a lot of noise about right now will change, and other stuff will stay, but by the time it comes out, it's not going to be the end of the world anymore. And it's fine. You know why? Because it's not the final version of D&D. They will make future editions of the game that will have their own bad stuff and good stuff. It's
yeah. I'll be interested to know if this just becomes known as 6D in the end, as 5e did.
I think the most likely case for One D&D, whatever it ends up being, is that it will essentially be a World of Warcraft-tized D&D. And I don't mean that in the way that it, like 4th edition was often labeled the World of Warcraft D&D. It will be D&D as a live service business model. You will get regular updates to the way the core of the game functions, that you might even call them expansion packs. We call them splat books. It's the same sort of thing that will constantly be tinkering with the core of the game. And through services like D&D Beyond, you'll be able to do patch notes very, very easily. There may be something to learn from the way 4th edition did errata there. But for the most part, I think it's entirely possible we will never see a new edition of D&D. It will just be D&D, and by the time 10 years have passed, it will have Ship of Theseus itself into a new edition of D&D. But where does one end and where does the other begin?
True.
In terms of community feedback, one of the best ways to get community feedback is not to ask, but to watch. It's not to ask, what do you like? What do you think of this? It's to go on in D&D Beyond and see what character class everyone's using. And we now see feats becoming something that everyone is going to be using. Well, why would they add feats when they didn't use them, or they used them as optional in 5e? Maybe because the feedback they got was feats are a little too complicated for most people. We want to keep it simple. We'll make it optional. But when you see everybody playing the variant human on D&D Beyond, you know that they're taking that not because of all the cool things that the human gets. They're taking it because they get a free feat. So while people might say feats are complicated and we don't want it in our core game, the use bears out a different story, which has now become the feedback that has led us to backgrounds, including a feat.
I think there's also that feedback that the background feature seem to be based around like, it's not a mechanical advantage. It's not a something that makes you better in combat or anything like that. It's a place to eat and sleep, as it turned out to be more often than not. But they've the feats seem to be replacing that in terms of like, and that seems to be, honestly, now that I think about it, the design for this Unearthed Arcana, at least overall, is taking some things that were sort of floaty and up here, like inspiration, like natural 20s, what happens when you get one, and like, those sort of like background features, and really grounding them with a mechanical buff that sort of, quote unquote matters in the game. Those other things definitely mattered, but this has, you'll never forget about inspiration now because you get it whenever you roll a natural 20, or the musician plays a song and people get it during their short rests. Go ahead, Dael.
Oh, I was just going to say that, yeah, it's having all this stuff pinned down. I actually think a lot of it is a step in the right direction, right? Like I have been on the record on this podcast before being like, grumble, I don't know how I feel about these feats attached to, like, actual feats attached to backgrounds. That seems complicated, even though it is ultimately actually what I wanted. I just didn't really want them to be called feats and have to look them up in a separate part of the book. But it actually functionally makes sense. What I would love to see is some of them that really bolster mechanically the other pillars of play, because backgrounds are a great opportunity to give you feats that give you mechanical boosts to exploration and social pillars rather than combat. Because the combat ones that we're seeing are dope, totally badass, but we've got so many of them that I feel like that would be cool to just push it a little bit further. And that's kind of how I feel about a lot of this stuff. I think moving the ability score increases to background, I've been banging that drum forever. That's great. Love that. Then there are things like moving language from race choice to background choice. I'm glad that we've moved it away from being implicitly tied to race, but it doesn't quite make sense where it is in background either. It's strange to me that they're like, you're a charlatan, so you speak the language of hell.
You're a gladiator, so you speak the language of orcs, because gladiators are orcs.
Yeah, they kind of ended up in the same problem of
you're a town guard. Yeah, you're a town guard, so you speak Dwarvish because the people who make the armor are dwarves. And I'm like, okay, but now you're just getting into my world building. Shoo. And then they followed up by saying, also pick another extra language, just whatever you want. And I feel like if you were willing to do that, just do that anyway. Just have the languages floating. Ask some questions about it. That's a fine way to build a character. Say, pick a language. Why do you know it? Do you have a friend who speaks that language? Did you grow up in, a town of orcs? Give leading questions and get people to create a character based on that, because that's what backgrounds are doing anyway.
Well, I feel like that's what they want to do, right? Because they've basically said, like, you can invent your background is first. And I think Jeremy Crawford said this in that hour-long discussion. The intention is you can create your background first, or if you need some suggestions, here are some, rather than here are the backgrounds, or you can create your own if you want to. And I get the sense that when they were writing the charlatan, they came to language and they were like, we need what language does a charlatan speak? And someone from the other side of the office was like, Infernal.
Why not sign language? They've got sign language now. Give them
Infernal yet.
All right.
We gotta make it.
Yeah, Infernal.
Liars go to hell, right? Sorry, Shawn, go ahead.
No, I mean, why are we not just tying either choose whatever ability score you want, or tie it to class? Why are we playing this game of putting ability score increases in other places where it focuses now? Well, I want to be a fighter. I have to check which background gives me a bonus to strength. Well, I guess I'm going to be a soldier, or whatever gives the bonus to strength. Why do that? Why make you? Dael said it all. It's like, right? Why pigeonhole the character that I want to create? Why build the world for me when you're trusting me to do all this other work as the dungeon master? Why put these things in there that pigeonhole my world?
I think what they're trying to do is the opposite, honestly, in terms of trying to make, like, the backgrounds they have in this UA, I really think are only meant as examples so that you can create your own background that does work for you and the GM's world. The reason not to tie it to classes, I have this dude who plays in my game. He's one of my best friends for since primary school. Love him to bits. I don't know if he watches this podcast or not, but he loves a suboptimal build. And at the moment he's actually playing a monster hunter, but he started as a fighter and his like strength score is in the toilet. But his intelligence score is really high because he just wants to play this like ordinary dude who is thrust into extraordinary circumstances. He doesn't want to play like a high intelligence wizard. He doesn't want to be a mage. He just wants to play this like, guy that ends up becoming a hero over the course of playing the campaign, which is hilarious because we get into combat situations and it's like, all right, Thomas, it's your turn. What are you doing? He's like, I didn't bring any weapons. I don't carry weapons. I throw a brick at him. I don't know. And it's like, oh, damn it, Thomas. Why don't you bring your spear? Hilarious for the GM, maybe frustrating for the other players. But I think that's maybe why they've tried to put it in backgrounds and not tie it to anything else.
I think that character concept is delightful. It's a very literary sort of character. I think that it's in the vast minority of the types of characters that will be played in 5th edition. And so, if we tie abilities to a class, for example, yes, it does kind of step on that character concept, but wouldn't the net gain of simplifying that aspect of character creation and then be better than, this one person comes to you and says, I want to play a kind of a goofus who becomes a hero. Can I have my +1 to strength from fighter be a +1 to intelligence instead? And the GM is like, yes, of course. Why is this a question?
Sure.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me as someone who I held off on 5e for a really long time, partially because the backgrounds felt stifling to me. Even though you can make your own background, the way that they talk about designing your own background still feels like it felt like you were forced to do some things with your background that I wouldn't have otherwise chosen for myself. Whereas something like Pathfinder, which I was playing at the time, is very finicky, granular. You build it yourself. And I could see that the backgrounds were intended to like draw you towards character and role playing. It tells you were a sailor. So that is like a backstory for you if you struggle to make a backstory. But I think mechanically, they've always struggled to actually encourage that, which is why I think some feats should be about roleplay or exploration in a way that doesn't negate roleplay and exploration, because that has been kind of the key fault in attempts to do that thus far has been, this will help you in exploration by making you not have to worry about it ever, which is not ideal. I do think it's interesting that, there's so many little mechanical implications, but feats are clearly core now. Up until now, they have been quote unquote optional, right? But now feats are clearly becoming a central part of the game. This is absolutely part of the game now. It's interesting that they call them first level feats, which indicates that you're going to have possibly a structure more similar to 4th edition, where it's like you hit this level, you choose a feat. It's seeming to me like it might be not only a present element of the game, but an encouraged, a pushed one. I need better words.
It strikes me in hindsight now that remember those Dragonlance backgrounds that had feats in them?
Yeah.
Remember how everyone got all bent out of shape after that? Well, yes, of course they have feats in them because they're being designed with this rule set in mind.
Yeah, that's where they seem to be going.
Yeah. Which again acclimatized me so that I wasn't shocked and horrified when I saw it in this.
I think,
place.
Like Shawn said earlier, they've got the data through D&D Beyond, and I think it might have been in the episode with Kelly and Monty that we were talking about feats, and it was like, they're an optional rule, but probably 90% of tables play with them because, and a lot of the things that they're kind of grounding in this in terms of like critical hits or getting inspiration on a nat 20, a feat in your background, all that sort of stuff seems to be taking a lot of things that were optional for the GM originally and really giving them to the players so that a universal experience is felt rather than getting to another table and the GM going, oh, I don't use feats, or, oh, I'm sorry, I forget about inspiration all the time. I don't really use it. When that player might really enjoy being able to figure out ways to get inspiration or really enjoy building feat-based characters. We are going a little bit over time, but I want to do a quick lightning round. We had a bunch of questions in the chat that I didn't want to interrupt the conversation to ask, so I apologize, chat. How we feel about the new critical hit rules. I'm assuming specifically the fact that GMs can no longer critical hit, the fact that a natural 20, quote unquote, always succeeds, which I don't think it does in the rules as they've written it. But that seems to be the takeaway everybody's taken from the new crit rules. How do we feel about these?
I'll do it blitz style. Ability checks can crit. Good. Well, the GM can't crit. Mixed. Makes encounter design easier. Lessens explosive fun. And D&D thrives on explosive fun. 30 seconds or less.
All right, Shawn, your 30 seconds starts now.
Oh boy. I'd pass.
All right, I'll give you a second to think about it and maybe an extra 10 minutes. Dael, how do you feel?
I mean, I feel like I already said my thing. I feel like crits should be part of the folk element of the game and should be table to table. So I don't have strong feelings about necessarily how they've been implemented, but I just have strong feelings about them, setting it in stone.
Yeah. Okay. Shawn, anything you want to add, or you're playing dumb on this one?
No, I think it's fine. I think we will see changes to it. I like the fact that you only double the dice, the weapon dice, rather than sneak attack, paladin, smite, all of that. I think that helps with encounter balance, as James was talking about as well.
Question from 491 Phantom. Do you think Wizards of the Coast will restrict D&D Beyond use on third-party VTTs when they release their VTT? So my understanding, just for my sake and anybody who doesn't quite understand this sake, Roll20, I believe, and maybe some others have like plugins with D&D Beyond allowing you to basically port your character in. Is that correct?
Yeah, Beyond 20 is a common sort of bootstrapping application, and I do not really know how it works.
There's also
on this
like
one. I'm not smart enough to answer
it. Beyond 20 is not an official licensed thing for anyone. It is simply something that was created that will sit in your browser and do the work for you. As far as I know, and that may have changed recently, but that's the thing. So that does not make people happy on the business side of things. It makes players very happy. So there you go.
If anything, we might see something similar to like after Halo. I think Bungie licensed out a bunch of like Halo usage rights to mobile games. And then over time they were like, wait, we want to make the mobile games. And so they just let those contracts die out slowly over time. I don't think there's going to be any kind of hard line. You can no longer use it right now. I think that there probably are pre-existing agreements that have expiry dates and they will just let them run out, if anything. But I don't think that necessarily means that it will stop them from existing, because there are enterprising people out in the world who write programs and make plugins and add-ons, and something like Roll20 is designed to be programmed and accept plugins and add-ons. So I think it'll be a complicated situation, even if it ends up being legally straightforward.
Gotcha. I'm just quickly going to do a quick scroll here. One other question coming in from Fen Fern is, how about them new grappling rules, huh? Aren't they a thing?
Yeah.
How does slowed work?
Good name, Fen Fern.
I discovered through Twitter, apparently I'm the only one who has a problem with grappling. And I've had monsters pushed on their back and then grappled to the ground, and then everybody just like kicking it in the ribs and wailing upon it. A couple of times too many for me to feel comfortable with grappling getting a bit of a buff.
I don't know. I feel like grappling's always been a bit underwhelming. So maybe you and I just have different experiences. I don't love the new grappling rules, but I didn't love the earlier grappling rules. So I'm kind of I'm ambivalent.
I was very happy when 5th edition released the simplest grappling rules I've ever seen. And I don't need to be any more complicated than that.
Oh, there's already questions that I have based on what's written here, which is you cannot escape using an action as it's written. You can only attempt to escape at the end of each of your turns, which means if you escape, you have no move left, so you're still standing next to whatever was grappling you. So if it's just you on your turn trying to do something, there's also this weird thing about if you are grappling someone and you move them, you are slowed while you're moving. And if you are slowed, attack rolls against you have advantage. So how does that work with opportunity attacks? Are you technically moving, or does the opportunity attack come before you are moving so you're not slowed until you move? And what if I ready an action to attack you as you're moving if you're grappling something and you're slowed? Do then I have advantage? It's already all this weird stuff. And as James said, leave it be.
Back to complicated grappling.
Exactly.
Well, does the grappled have advantage against the grappler when the grappler is moving the grappled?
That's a very good question.
I'm just asking the questions.
Oh,
yes.
I'm just
this terminology is going to get tricky quick. There's a question from Ishmael Ishmingsmill, which is about how do we feel about the arcane, divine, or primal categories of spells?
Great.
No problem.
Yeah, I like that. Grim Hollow already kind of tried to split, though. I mean, they've already been sort of broadly split, I think, in people's minds. The one thing I have about that is whether that ends up solidifying. There's a lot of talk. I think it's the Storm Sorcerer technically can't take Lightning Bolt. Is it? Is that? Am I thinking correctly there? There's some like lightning themed spell a sorcerer can't take. Yeah, maybe that's what I'm thinking of because it's technically not on their spell list, and most GMs will just be like, well, take it. Who cares? Like, it's fine. I would imagine. But does splitting these out obviously broadens the spell list so that obviously a sorcerer would in theory have access to more spells. But does the way that these spells work get more calcified in those three definitions, meaning like anything outside of a divine spell can't technically be a healing spell because that is only the domain of like divine spell casting. So could you not create a healing wizard? You'd probably want to create
kind of how it is
anyway.
already, isn't it though?
Broadly, yeah, I suppose that's true.
I think that it's largely neat. Having this switch, I'm assuming that with these spell lists, we're dropping the individual caster class spell lists, which is great. But I do think it's interesting the way that they've been divvied up. But I'm realizing that it's just kind of my own sort of associations. But seeing, for example, warlocks in the arcane spell list instead of the primal spell list surprised me a little bit. And I can't fully voice why. But that was a little moment where I went, ooh, we're going to end up with some fuzzy lines.
Well, maybe it's a thing of like, if you take, and for the record, I think Jeremy Crawford did say again in that D&D Beyond podcast thing that he did, that they're not doing away with spell lists entirely. There may still be some more specific spell lists, maybe for subclasses more so than whole classes. Maybe it becomes a thing of like, if you are a Pact of the Fiend or a Pact of the Great Old One, I'm sure they might rename and rejig those entirely. But that sort of style Pact Warlock, you draw your magic from the arcane spell list. If you're a Pact of the Fae or a Pact of the Elemental or Primordial or whatever, then you draw your spells from the primal spell list. And so it creates greater variation between.
Which honestly would be pretty cool.
To me. Yeah.
What if
it harkens back to
cool.
4th edition
seem too
with their 4
complicated.
power sources, Martial,
Yeah.
Arcane, Divine, and it wasn't primal, but it was something, similar.
Something I should know, but I don't.
What if they conflate the druid and the wizard and they just make them one class? But if you choose to draw spells from the arcane spell list, you're a wizard, and if you choose to draw them from the
he's gone mad with power.
Bold move.
He has to be stopped.
I like that idea, but it's because I feel like the wild shape of the druid, while it's the druid's thing, it's the druid's sneak attack, it's the druid's divine smite, it's the heart of the class. I do feel like I want to play just a wizard
Part of the
that's
class!
a druid most of the time instead. But that's my low dark fantasy self speaking. Anyway, that is probably more than we have time for this week. So we're going to leave it there.
Golly, I just want to keep talking forever.
I mean, look, it's your time, so you tell me if you want to keep talking forever.
Ben, I've got a D&D game in 5 minutes. Let me go.
Well, that answers that question. Bye, everybody. We're going to go. We will be back next week on Twitch at 7 p.m. Eastern time, 4 p.m. The other time, Pacific time, or 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time if you happen to be in our part of the world. Everybody else figure it out. But the podcast will go up later in the week, every Wednesday, I believe, Eastern time. The podcast is up, so we will be back next week with another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Hit us with your emails if you have any questions about One D&D podcast at ghostfiregaming.com. And otherwise, just kind of, spread the word, let everybody know, let the Lorecast roll a natural 20 this week and get inspiration because you'll tell people about it. Anyway, goodbye. Have a good week.